Trauma Therapist Podcast Plus listeners can listen to episodes early and ad-free right now. Become a Plus listener by going to Apple Podcasts, searching for the Trauma Therapist Podcast, and signing up today. All right, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to help trauma therapists be their incredible selves, to be human, to be real, not just a clinician. I'm a big believer in who we are is more important than what we know. And this requires cultivating authenticity, genuineness, and vulnerability, and that requires intention. You can learn more about my courses and workshops by going to thetraumatherapistproject.com. That's thetraumatherapistproject.com. Let's get started. All right, here we go. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the podcast. I'm very excited to have as my guest today, Tomilyn Ward. Tomilyn, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right. So Tomilyn has a master's in professional counseling from Carlow University, and she's also an eye movement desensitization and reprocessing practitioner. She works with clients who've experienced traumatic births, adoption issues, PTSD, grief and loss, and voluntary and involuntary termination of parental rights. Tomilyn is also the founder of the Meyer Organization, a nonprofit focused on supporting people both during and after pregnancy. Tomilyn, welcome.
Thank you so much.
So before we get going here, share with the listeners where you're from originally and where you are currently.
Sure. Originally, I'm from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I did spend a good portion of my 20s in the Northeast, and I did teach business English overseas for a minute. And then I ended up coming back to Pittsburgh. It's my hometown. I really love being here, and I'm happy to be back.
Awesome. Business English.
Yes.
Interesting.
So I taught business English in Poland for about a year, and that was a very interesting and eye-opening experience. I got to learn a lot about culture, and one of the biggest things I learned there was small talk is really an American conversation piece. Small talk isn't something that was used in business, so I would teach people about small talk, and they would laugh and just think it was the funniest thing as we would do role plays and stuff like that.
Interesting.
So, yeah.
So how did the shift to becoming a therapist counselor come along?
Well, originally my parents wanted me to go to school to study business, which I did. I always wanted to be a psychologist. So I ended up going back to graduate school in 2009, and I kind of hit the floor running, becoming a trauma therapist. Originally, when I went back, I wanted to facilitate adoptions, which I did. I facilitated 10 newborn adoptions. And at that time, I was working in a homeless shelter for pregnant women. So I really had a lot of eye-opening experience. I learned a lot about the world through that position, working with the homeless pregnant women. I was providing counseling, provided support to them. Of course, there was shelter provided. And the nonprofit kind of just came out of the work we were doing.
So working at a homeless shelter for pregnant women, how did that come about? I mean, what are some of the things you did learn and some of the experiences you did have there? It sounds pretty fascinating.
I had so many experiences there. One of the things that I started doing when I was there, I was a therapist, but I was also attending births, especially for women who were placing their children for adoption. So I was finding myself just in this birth space with the women. So I was eventually trained as a doula. So I've attended over 30 births. So a lot of attending the births was advocating for helping the patient to advocate for their own rights, making sure they had their needs met. If partners were involved, helping partners to encourage the mom to be comfortable, to be able to relax, to also to help to calm the partners down if things went a little hairy, if there maybe was a C-section. I know a lot of times partners are, if there's an emergency C-section, partners are given an outfit to put on and told to sit in a room until a doctor comes back to get them. And that may be a short period of time. That may be 10 minutes, maybe an hour. But when you have no idea what's going on with your partner and their child, that can seem like an eternity. And there's usually no information given to the partner at that time because they're really focusing on the woman and the baby.
So what was the inspiration for you to work at a homeless center for pregnant women?
Well, I experienced my own birth trauma in 2008, and at that time there was no mental health support at all. When I went to my 6 week checkup, they gave me an SSRI, and they were like, "Hey, we'll see you later." Nobody ever suggested mental health counseling. I was able to get into mental health counseling with the university. I believe I did 5 CBT sessions, and back then they were still using GAF, the Global Access of Functioning, and they were like, "Your GAF's the highest we've ever seen. You don't need therapy." And I was like, "I need therapy. Like, I really need to be in therapy." There was no support at that time. I'm happy to report things are really changing, but we did a lot of advocacy work around pregnancy and postpartum periods. We've done a lot of work with a nonprofit around the maternal mortality rate here in Pennsylvania, which is very high. It's actually higher than Guatemala. And the maternal mortality rate is a maternal death before baby's 1 year old. So that could include birth or any postpartum mental illness or any postpartum complications within that first year. They consider that. But we have a very high rate here in Pennsylvania. So we did a lot of work to bring doula programs into the hospitals. The Maya organization offers doula programs in Spanish so that people are able to have support in their native language. We also have other languages that are available. We've certainly offered support through translation phones as well, which can be, you learn how to say certain words in certain languages really fast when it comes to labor. But it's just really supporting the people who are in this space, and a lot of times without family and scared and alone.
Yeah, I mean, to me, that population of homeless pregnant women just seems like a minefield of trauma and
Absolutely.
and everything. I'm wondering, can you share some of the stories? I mean, granted, everyone is different, but what are some of the stories or experiences you had there specifically?
Oh, I don't even know where to start. I would say that most people had generational trauma. Most people who were in that situation certainly grew up in poverty. They may not have had the best parents themselves. A lot of times we were dealing with younger women, like in their late teens, early 20s. It might have been their first baby. For that particular site, you weren't allowed to have another child with you. So, but a lot of times we were working with people who may have had children staying with relatives or children who had been removed by Children, Youth, and Family at some point. So we would try to help them build their parenting skills if they wanted to parent. Not everybody. We did also facilitate adoptions. Most people chose to parent, but there were people who knew that parenting wasn't the best idea for them.
Mm-hmm.
And they would make a birth or an adoption plan for their child.
I mean, we haven't even talked about substance use.
Oh, substance use was a huge part of that. I've certainly seen some really intense things. Most of the people who would make it to the program would be actively working on their recovery. So even if they were in a maintenance program, a methadone program, if they were on Subutex, there would be drug testing at the program. And
The program, is this the homeless shelter?
Yes.
Program? Okay. So in order to get in there, they'd had to be in recovery.
They had to be working towards their recovery.
Working towards recovery.
There were certainly a lot of people who slipped through the cracks. Marijuana wasn't legal at that time here. It's legal medically now, but there were people who would test positive for marijuana for their entire pregnancy and have a story about it. And it wasn't our place to put them on the street. But we did a lot of work with opiates. Opiates were huge at that time. Benzos, we were seeing a lot with benzos. I did spend a lot of time in the NICU with biological parents and with adoptive parents, having the babies go through withdrawal symptoms, helping them to calm the babies, supporting them in whatever way we could. There's also, as you can imagine, there's a lot of discrimination from hospital systems when we have women who are in recovery or especially early recovery. And if babies were, anytime that a baby is born exposed to opiates, they're going to go through at least a 5-day withdrawal, at least a 5-day check at the hospital, even if they don't have any symptoms.
Okay.
But I've had babies withdraw for as long as 60 days.
I want to ask about that, but before I do, walk us through your process of, granted, with the idea that everyone's different, but generally speaking, when you first meet or first met a woman in that shelter, what are you assessing? What are you asking? What are you trying to learn about first?
Sure. No, this was about 10 years ago, and there wasn't much structure to that for me as a therapist. I was one of the first therapists there. There were other, bachelor level social workers, things like that. Was programming. I would really sit down and get to know the person and learn where they were coming from, give them that space to open up. I'm a trauma therapist. A lot of that came from that work. And then I also worked in the county jail with women as well. But just really getting to learn about them, where they came from, how they had to live, how they survived up until that point, and how they potentially saw themselves as a parent or a functioning member of society. Most people did not want to be there. The goal was this was a transitional housing situation so that women could move on to either another program where they would be able to have their baby with them, or move on to some independent living, be able to have their own housing.
So, let's talk about the Maya organization. When did you found that, and why?
Sure. I founded Maya organization in 2009. The reason that I founded Maya, Maya stands for Me and You Always. So we celebrated all the ways families come together. At that time, I had already experienced a traumatic birth. I was exploring adoption myself, and it was so expensive to adopt. And this was prior to graduate school. So I started fundraising to help families be able to afford to adopt. At that time, I thought you shouldn't have to decide between having a car or adding a child to your life. That was essentially, the cost was astronomical. It still is. And
I'm sorry, to
from that,
adopt is
to adopt,
astronomical?
yes, to adopt. I had my first daughter was born in 2008. I adopted my second daughter in 2011, and that was the first birth that I was actually in, aside from my birth with my daughter. And this woman was not treated with respect by the agency that was providing the adoption services. She was essentially a paycheck, and I developed a relationship with her. She was giving me her child. And I really wanted to move into a space where women who were making that decision were able to be respected and to grow from that and to feel supported. And we did a lot of that with the Maya organization. And then the services grew. The very first time, our first year that we actually had funding, I think we had $10,000 in funding. That was in 2014. Funding outside of donations. We had state funding. The next year, our services grew 200%. We were supporting a number of pregnant women throughout our county, and we had developed programs by that time. We were giving away car seats and cribs if people attended so many classes. We were providing counseling, and we also started almost accidentally. We started a counseling program for women in the local jail. We have originally went in there to meet with some birth moms that we were working with, and I stepped foot into the jail, and people were begging for counseling. So I just brought on an intern from Carlow. where I graduated from. And within the first month, we had 40 clients and we had a wait list. We couldn't handle. All they wanted was mental health.
Tomlin, hang on. You are just like a one woman tour de force here. It's like you see an issue or a problem and you're like, boom, it needs attention. It needs light on it. It's like so freaking impressive.
It is. Well, thank you for that. But it grew because of the dedication of a lot of people. The nonprofit, I had just supervised their therapist at this point. I'm not the executive director at this. I stepped down in 2020, but they're doing so much. They are teaching classes at the local hospitals. They're teaching classes to providers. They're teaching anti-racism and obstetric racism to a very large local hospital. They're also teaching a number
You
of
said
different.
obstetric
Yeah.
as an obstetrician.
Yes.
What is that specifically?
Well, it's to the highest maternal mortality rate is going to be with our African American community, our Black and Brown moms in Pennsylvania. So making sure that our moms are heard, that their bodies are respected. A lot of times, the birth trauma is coming from women of all colors, of course, but from not being heard, from saying, "Hey, there's something wrong," whether it's before or after the delivery, like I know there's something wrong with my body, from people not being heard. Serena Williams is a really good example. She said, "Hey, there's something wrong here postpartum," and she really had to advocate for herself. And she is, one
She's
of the
Serena
hugest,
Williams.
yeah, hugest
Yeah.
tennis stars in the world, and she really had to advocate for herself. So teaching people how to advocate for themselves, also teaching doctors how to listen to that. To those voices, and to know when someone knows, hey, this is my body and I know there's something wrong. And I've seen in the births that I've been in, I have certainly seen births where an example that comes to mind, I had a woman, she was a refugee, and I was called into the birth as a doula, and she kept saying, I can feel this C-section, I can feel this C-section. And they kept saying, if you don't stop complaining about the pain, you can't be in pain, we're going to put you under and we're going to take your husband out of the room. And she was so scared and she was so terrified. And afterwards, one of the delivering nurses pulled me aside, and I could tell there was something else going on in the room, but I wasn't going to say that. I was focusing on her. But she pulled me aside. She was like, "Did you catch what was going on there?" And I was like, I didn't. I knew there was something going on. And she said her uterus was about to rupture. She was feeling the pain, but they weren't allowing her the space to say, I mean, that's a very big deal. She could have passed had her uterus ruptured. So they weren't managing her pain, and they were being confrontational when she was saying, I can feel this. I can feel this in my body.
And was this predominantly this happens with what? Lower SES, women of color?
Predominantly, but it can happen. I've had it happen with all kinds of women. It's just about not being heard or not. I know in my own experience with my birth trauma, I thought that, here I was educated. I had a 4-year degree, but these are doctors. They know what's right. Who am I to say, like, I never had a baby before. Who am I to know what I should be doing or shouldn't be doing? So allowing people to have that voice, or to at least have that space to advocate for themselves, or say, hey, this doesn't feel right, or I think maybe we need to move this in a different direction.
So how does I was going to say, how does Maya do that specifically?
Well, Maya does that through their doula program, particularly with the doula program in people's native languages, like allowing them that voice. I've been to births, or I've been called into births after, like postpartum, maybe because someone was considering adoption, where the woman didn't ask for water because they didn't know how, and they didn't have any water during the birth or after. They didn't know how to ask for it, or they were afraid. So just having more of a safe space, having at least one person that they can rely on so that they can hear themselves, and also someone who knows what is kind of happening, knows the layout of the hospital, knows what to expect if there's anything going on, or if it's a normal, really easy birth too. Like, hey, like you're at 8 centimeters. This is how you're going to feel. This is how you're going to look. Things are probably going to start moving a little bit faster. It's not there to give medical advice, but it's there to provide emotional support. And
As a doula.
as a doula.
Okay.
But also the classes, the advocacy classes that are being taught at a local university, at a local hospital, the jail program, Maya's just expanded their contract. They are creating, this is the first time ever, I'm so proud of them. They are creating a safe space at the jail for our pregnant women, so that they can have this doula program. We've been providing classes in there for a number of years, but we've never been given our own space. It's always been in the gym. And also they just got a contract with the jail to provide doula services for our incarcerated women who, up until 2017, were still being shackled to the beds when they were in labor and delivery.
Yeah.
So, those, I've been to some of those births as well, and there's usually a male guard standing there in the delivery room. There's been times where there's been a respectful guard who will step out, but if someone's in the middle of labor, if they're outside the door, there's really not too many places they can go.
Right.
And if you're in the county jail, you're probably not convicted of, well, you're clearly not convicted yet, but it's probably not a high risk crime either.
Now, you said you since stepped down from the Maya.
So my organization was my first baby, and I've been in private practice since 2020, and we still focus on birth trauma. We're actually having a CEU program in January in partnership with White Deer Run, which is a rehab in this area. We're teaching about reproductive trauma, not just birth trauma, perinatal, postpartum, but we're also going to be focusing on infertility, and other birth loss. Perinatal loss is huge. It's something that we see quite often. How to help people, both partners, cope through that and repair their relationship if there's any breaks. It can be very hard, especially on a newer, younger relationship. Just helping them to find a space to heal. And also, a lot of times, be able to honor their child.
Perinatal loss. How is that defined?
So, perinatal loss, I believe, I would really say any loss during pregnancy. So, if we have a miscarriage early on, if someone is really struggling with that, we will work with that. A lot of times, we're talking about loss after 20 weeks, which that's 5 months. There's really not I don't want to put a timeline on how it hurts somebody to have a loss, whether it's considered a miscarriage or a stillborn. A stillborn would be after 20 weeks. But we work with practitioners and our clients, of course, to recognize the signs, make sure you're reading the intake correctly, so that you're prepared. It's quite often I see people referring to especially if it's a new loss, referring to their babies as being here, as being present. So preparing, if someone's reading the intake differently than the reality of the situation, preparing the clinician to handle that situation appropriately. And asking the appropriate questions if there's a loss, because you would be working with a postpartum mom with a baby at home much differently with a mom than a mom who is grieving their child. They're still postpartum. They're still going through all the body changes, but they don't have that baby at home.
Wow, I mean, so intense. So this work is very specialized. What do you feel what's called you to this? I mean, you did mention your own experience, but can you talk a little bit about that? What brings you to this?
Sure, I would definitely say this feels like a calling. My own experience definitely came into it in the beginning. I could say I can relate to clients in a lot of way. I don't bring that into a session. I don't. My clients typically do not know that I had a traumatic birth, and um, but just being, like being in the hospital system, understanding how the hospital works, understanding how doctors can respond to people of, the way that somebody responds, a doctor may respond to a patient who's intellectually disabled, and the way a doctor may respond to a patient with a PhD, it can be very different. And just understanding that the patient's experience, or the mom's experience, let's say, their perception is their experience. If they felt that they were disrespected or not heard by the doctor, um, that is their experience, whether that was true or not, and really meeting them where they're at and just helping them get to a place where they can find healing.
And what are some of the ways you interact with the physicians or the medical staff? I mean, I can imagine, you being there, you being present and advocating for the mother, but in what ways do you do
Well,
that
we
with?
have the mother, like we help them to advocate for themselves. Really, a doula is not a medical person. So a doula is an emotional, so is an emotional support. So the way that I interacted with the doctors would be professionally. It would be respectfully, the doctors and the nurses. Um, During my time as a doula, people knew I was also a trained therapist, so I would often get called to births where there was some mental health issues.
Mhm.
Um, but with a great deal of respect, so that
Well, I mean, I understand that, of course,
yeah.
but you said you're helping the client or the mother advocate for themselves. So you're kind of guiding them or educating them how to ask for what they need, as opposed to you
Yes.
asking for okay.
So, in an example of that might be a breastfeeding mom. Like if we have a relatively normal delivery, mom wants to breastfeed. Some nurses would want to give the baby a formula to get their sugar up right away, and not allow that child the time. It usually takes about 45 minutes for that first latch. So helping people to have their voice in that space, helping them to have a birth plan, but also making sure they're aware, hey, here's a birth plan, but that birth is very unpredictable. We don't know what's
Hmm.
going to happen. Like this, these are your desires and your wishes, but ultimately it is up to your medical team. I have certainly been in births, especially with women who were struggling with inactive addiction where they weren't being heard. I can recall one birth where this was the woman's fourth child, and she was from a different town, and she kept telling the doctors, I need to have a C-section with my last child. They said I always have to have a C-section. And they were just pushing and just not hearing her. And I was in the C-section, and I could hear them in the C-section saying, hey, she needed a C-section. She couldn't have had this baby another way. I've
Hmm.
also been in a birth with a 15-year-old girl. I went to the hospital with her early in the morning, and they said she's not in labor. They sent her home. Her guardian called me about 6 hours later. They were at the hospital. She was fully dilated. By the time I got back to the hospital, she was having that baby without any medication. And the doctors came out, and they were joking about it. They said, hey, this is biologically the best time to have a baby, just not psychosocially.
Oh my God.
Um, so making sure that the patient is viewed as a person.
Wow.
I mean, here's a little girl having a baby without medication, because the doctors wouldn't listen to her when she was in active labor 6 hours before.
Oh my God. All right, Tomlin. Wow. Very intense. My God.
Sorry
Uh,
about that.
no, not at all. I mean, this is what this is about. All right. So, how do people contact you?
The best way to contact us is through our website, which is My Wellness, PGH. That's the abbreviation for Pittsburgh.com. And I think that's going to be in the show notes.
Yep, we'll have that in show notes definitely, as well as my organization will have that listed as well.
Okay.
Awesome. Appreciate you being on here, and really glad you're out there doing that incredible work, man. We need people like you.
Well, I appreciate you. You're really doing the incredible work as well. So
Awesome. All right. Take care.
thank you. You too.